There is one exact dollar amount where your money stops crawling and starts to ignite. Below that number, growth feels invisible, like nothing you do moves the needle. Above it, your investments quietly earn more in a year than you could save in that same year on your own. And here is the part that should bother you. The place where almost everyone gives up sits just short of that line. They walk away in the final stretch, right before the thing they were waiting for begins. So what is that number, and why does almost nobody reach it? How does someone go from feeling like their investing is pointless to watching their account grow faster than their own paycheck can fill it? The answer is not a secret fund. It is not a perfect stock pick or some strategy reserved for people with connections. What it comes down to is a single threshold, a line that sits in roughly the same spot for almost everyone, and what happens to your money the moment you finally cross it. Let me show you the thing nobody warns you about when you start. In the beginning, investing feels like pushing a heavy cart up a long, flat road. You put in the work week after week, and you see almost nothing in return. That feeling is not in your head, and it does not mean you chose the wrong account or the wrong fund. What you are feeling is the actual math of how compounding behaves in its earliest years, and once you understand it, you stop blaming yourself for the slow part, and you stop quitting during it. Meet a saver we will call Marin. She is 32 years old, she earns a normal middle-class income, and she has decided to finally get serious about her future. Her plan is simple. She sets up an automatic transfer of a little under $600 a month into a plain, boring index fund inside her retirement account. That works out to about $7,000 a year, right around what the rules allow an ordinary person to put into an individual retirement account. For her long-run return, she uses a calm, conservative assumption of 7% a year, which sits comfortably below the stock market's historical average and leaves plenty of room for ugly decades along the way. Now watch what actually happens to her money, because this is where most savers lose faith. At the end of her very first year, Marin has the $7,000 she contributed and basically no growth at all, because money she just put in has had almost no time to do anything. In year 2, her balance climbs to around $14,500, and the growth portion is only about $500. After 2 full years of real discipline, her money earned her roughly the price of one nice dinner out. By year 5, she has about $40,000 saved, and the growth that year is a little over $2,000. That is real progress, but step into her shoes for a second. She personally added $7,000. The market added $2,000. So she is still doing more than 3/4 of the heavy lifting with her own paycheck. From where she is standing, this does not feel like the magic of compounding that anyone described to her. It feels like a glorified savings account that occasionally has a good month. And there is a number that quietly lies to you during these years: the percentage. A strong year in the market, say the whole thing climbs 15%, sounds enormous when you hear it on the news. But 15% of $40,000 is only $6,000. Even a spectacular year this early adds less than you put in by hand. So you read that the market just had a banner year, you open your account expecting fireworks, and you find a modest bump that does not match the headline at all. This is one of the quiet reasons people conclude that investing simply does not work for someone like them. They are judging the engine by its percentage, while the balance behind it is still tiny, and a big slice of a small number is still a small number. That percentage only becomes thrilling once the balance grows large, which is the entire reason for surviving the climb in the first place. Here is a reframe that changes how the scary years feel. When the market drops during your climb, and at some point it certainly will, every contribution you make is buying the same investments on sale. The crash that terrifies everyone else is quietly handing the patient saver more shares for the same money. Marin had no idea which years would be down years, so she simply kept buying on her schedule through all of them, scooping up cheap shares in the bad stretches without ever having to guess the timing. Those discounted shares she bought during the frightening years often grow into the largest part of the fire later on. A downturn is not really a threat to someone still climbing. For the disciplined buyer who keeps feeding the account while prices are low, it lands closer to a gift. The only people a crash truly ruins are the ones who panic and sell into it, turning a temporary dip into a permanent loss. This is the exact stretch that breaks people. Year after year, you are the engine doing nearly all of the work, and the compounding everyone promised you is barely a whisper in the corner. The cruel timing of it is that this slow, thankless part is not evidence that you are failing. It is the toll you pay right before the road finally tilts downhill and gravity starts working in your favor. It helps to think of an investment account as having 3 distinct stages of life, because almost nobody tells you they exist. The first stage is the long climb, those early years where your own contributions are doing nearly everything and the growth is too small to feel. Then comes the ignition, a single year where the math quietly flips and your money starts out earning your saving. Last is the cruise, where the growth becomes the main event and your contributions turn into a small bonus on top of a fire that is already roaring. Almost everyone who quits does it in stage 1, convinced that stage 1 is all there is. They never find out that the entire point of the climb was to reach the ignition. Before we name the number, let me defend that 7% assumption, because it matters. Over the long sweep of history, a broad basket of American stocks has returned somewhere close to 10% a year on average before adjusting for inflation. Marin is deliberately planning with 7 instead, giving herself a cushion in case the next few decades are stingier than the last few. If she is wrong, and the market behaves closer to its historical norm, every single timeline you are about to hear gets shorter and the fire lights even sooner. Planning with the cautious number means reality is more likely to surprise her in the right direction. That is the opposite of how most people gamble with their money, and it is a quiet edge that compounds just like the dollars do. Now you might be thinking that $7,000 a year is more than you can spare, and that is a fair thing to say out loud. So let me deal with it head on, because the principle does not abandon you just because your number is smaller. The line we are about to talk about simply moves to match what you contribute. If you can only invest $500 a month, around $6,000 a year, your ignition point lands at about $86,000 instead. If you eventually push your contributions up to $12,000 a year, the line rises to roughly $170,000. And if you ever max out a workplace 401k at the new 2026 limit of $24,500 a year, your crossover sits all the way up near $350,000. The threshold scales with you, but the rule underneath it never changes. There is always a number where the market starts matching your effort, and your only job is to climb to it without letting go. So let me give you the number most people came here for, and exactly why it is the number rather than some figure I invented for a thumbnail. Compounding catches fire at the precise moment your money earns more in a year than you put in that year. That single flip is the whole game. Before that point, you are carrying your portfolio up the hill on your back. After it, your portfolio starts carrying you. So the real question becomes refreshingly simple. How large does your balance need to be before 7% of it equals 1 full year of your contributions? Here is the arithmetic in plain language. If you are adding $7,000 a year, you need your yearly growth to also reach $7,000 in order to match it. 7% of what number gives you $7,000? $100,000. That is the line. $100,000 is the spot where a single year of growth, $7,000, finally equals an entire year of your own saving. Cross it, and for the first time in your life, the market is pulling its weight as hard as you are. This happens to be the same threshold the legendary investor Charlie Munger pointed at decades ago, back at a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting in the 1990s, when he said the first 100,000 is the hardest, and that once you have it, you can ease off the gas a little because the momentum takes over. He was not being poetic or sentimental. He was describing this exact crossover, the moment your money quietly switches from passenger to engine, and he understood that almost everyone underestimates how hard and how worth it that first stretch really is. Watch the ignition happen inside Marin's account. She is adding $7,000 a year at 7%, and it takes her about 11 years to reach that first $100,000. In that 11th year, the growth on her balance comes in close to $6,800, almost the entire amount she contributed herself. The very next year, the growth leaps past $7,700. Hold that against everything that came before. For the first time ever, her money earned her more than she added with her own hands. The fire is lit, and it happened without a single dramatic event. This is the detail that almost everyone misses, and it matters more than any tip you will ever hear. Nothing about Marin changed in that 12th year. She did not get a raise. There was no hot investment she happened to stumble onto. Nothing in her habits suddenly improved, and she learned no clever trick. The only thing that changed was that her balance finally grew big enough for the math to take over the workload. The ignition point was never about her effort or her intelligence. It was about her staying in the game long enough to reach the line where the rules of compounding flip in her favor. And now comes the part that should make you a little angry on behalf of everyone who quit, because almost nobody actually reaches that line, and what makes it tragic is how close they get before they walk away from it. Let me show you where the typical American truly stands. Vanguard runs one of the largest retirement studies in the country called How America Saves, and the 2026 edition is built on millions of real accounts. The median balance across all of them, meaning the person sitting at the exact midpoint, is only about $44,000. A lot of people assume the typical saver is somewhere near the finish line. They are wrong by a wide margin. $44,000 is nowhere near the fire. It sits right in the dead zone, the brutal stretch where the market is still adding only a couple thousand a year, and the whole effort still feels like it is barely working. It gets more uncomfortable the closer you look, even among workers in their late 40s and early 50s. People deep into their careers and supposedly in their peak earning years, the median balance is still under $80,000. That number sits below the line. It lives in the part of the climb where growth still feels invisible. A huge share of the country is parked more or less permanently inside the exact stretch that comes right before ignition, never quite reaching the point where the math would finally start rewarding all those years of effort. So why do they stop? Not because they are lazy or foolish. They stop because the danger zone is psychologically brutal to live through. Imagine the experience from the inside. You have been contributing faithfully for 6, 7, 8 years. By now, there is somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000 to show for it. Getting there meant skipping trips and saying no to things you genuinely wanted. And the account is still growing at a pace that feels almost insulting compared to the sacrifice. Then real life shows up at the worst possible time. A car transmission dies. The roof starts leaking. Then a medical bill arrives that nobody planned for. Sitting right there is a pile of money that honestly feels like it has not been doing much for you anyway. So people pause their contributions to catch their breath. Or worse, they cash the whole thing out and promise themselves they will start again someday. There is a well-documented pattern that makes this even sadder. Study after study finds that the average investor actually earns less than the funds they own, and the reason is behavior. People jump in when they feel confident and bail out when they feel scared, and in doing so, they repeatedly interrupt the one thing that needed to be left alone. The fund does fine. Its owner does not, because that owner keeps yanking the cart back down the hill just as it gains speed. The single most underrated skill in all of investing is not picking winners. It is the ability to do nothing on purpose for a very long time, especially during the years when doing nothing feels unbearable. This is exactly why the boring mechanics matter more than the exciting ones. Marin did not survive the danger zone on willpower because willpower runs out at the worst moments. She survived it on automation. The transfer left her checking account every month before she ever saw the money. The contribution happened whether she felt motivated or not, and the investment bought itself on a schedule no mood could cancel. Paying yourself first automatically turns a decade of hard decisions into a single decision you make one time. The people who reach the line almost never white-knuckle their way there. They quietly remove themselves from the choice. Let me put a real face on the two paths, because the gap between them is enormous. Marin almost became the person who stops. Around year 8, with roughly $70,000 saved and a very tempting reason to quit, she came within an inch of pulling the plug. A second saver we will call Caleb started at the very same time with the very same plan. And when his own moment of doubt arrived, he simply let the automation keep running and looked away from the account for a while. Look at where these two stood when the doubt hit, because on the surface, they were identical. At year 5, both of them had roughly $40,000 and the same nagging sense that nothing was happening. At year 8, both sat near $70,000, close enough to taste real money, yet still short of the line, still watching the market at only a few thousand a year against everything they had given up to get there. From the inside, that moment is indistinguishable for the quitter and the finisher. Neither one can see the fire coming. Neither one gets a signal that whispers, "Hold on, you are almost there." The only difference between these two savers is invisible in the moment and enormous in hindsight. One of them kept feeding the account through the discomfort, and one of them did not. That is the entire fork. It is not a difference in income, intelligence, or luck. It is a single quiet choice made at the exact point where the choice feels least rewarding, when the balance is large enough to tempt you and still too small to thank you. Marin stood at that fork and almost walked away from all of it. What saved her was not a sudden burst of motivation. It was that she had set the whole thing up years earlier to run without asking her permission. So doing nothing had quietly become easier than doing the destructive thing. Here is what that fork in the road actually cost. Say you stop adding new money at year 8, around $70,000, but you at least leave what you have invested and let it ride for the next 22 years. You still end up with a little over $300,000 purely from refusing to touch it. That is not nothing. But the person who simply kept contributing through that same window finishes with about $660,000. The quiet decision to keep going through the boring stretch, the one that felt completely pointless while it was happening, turned out to be worth more than $300,000. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. And remember, that is the gentler version of giving up. The person who cashes out their $70,000 to spend it does far worse than lose future growth. After income taxes and the early withdrawal penalty that retirement accounts hit you with, they often walk away with a chunk noticeably smaller than the balance even showed on screen. And they hand back every single year of slow, grinding progress they already paid for in advance, They were standing roughly 3 years from the fire, and they burned the firewood for one cold night. If you have ever felt that exact urge to give up on a balance that seems frozen in place, take a moment to subscribe, because this channel exists to keep you steady during the precise stretch where most savers walk away. Everything here is built to help you reach the part of the journey where the math finally starts working for you instead of against you, and to make sure you are still standing when it does. So let me show you the reward waiting on the other side of that line, because this is where it stops being a grind and starts looking almost unfair in your favor. That first $100,000 took Marin about 11 years of patience. Watch how quickly the next ones arrive. Still adding the same $7,000 a year, her jump from $100,000 to $200,000 takes only about 6 years. The leap from $200,000 to $300,000 takes around 4 years. Going from $300,000 to $400,000 takes roughly 3 years, and $400,000 to $500,000 about 3 years again. The same $100,000 climb that once swallowed more than a decade now happens in a fraction of the time, and it keeps getting faster the higher she goes. The contribution stays the same every year, and so does the assumed return. What changes year after year is only the speed. That acceleration is the fire itself, and it simply does not exist on the near side of the line. There is a clean reason this happens, and it explains the entire phenomenon. At $100,000, your money throws off about $7,000 a year on its own. At $200,000, it throws off $14,000. By $500,000, it is generating around $35,000 a year in growth, which is more than many people manage to save out of their salary across several years combined. Your balance has quietly become a second worker standing beside you. Unlike you, that worker never takes a sick day, never burns out, never asks for time off, and never demands a raise. The larger it grows, the harder it works, and at a full $1 million, it is producing $70,000 a year while you do absolutely nothing. There is a simple shorthand for how fast this engine runs. At 7%, money tends to double itself roughly every 10 years without you adding a thing. So the $100,000 you fought so hard for becomes $200,000 on its own in about a decade, then $400,000 in the decade after that, then $800,000 in the one after that. Each doubling is larger than every gain that came before it combined. That is the strange thing about this curve. The most spectacular growth of your entire life happens in the years when you are doing the least. Pay attention to this next comparison, because it explains why patience beats almost every clever move you could make. Take that first $100,000 and imagine you never add another single dollar to it. You just walk away and leave it completely alone for 20 years. It grows on its own to roughly $387,000. Now imagine a different person who starts from zero and faithfully contributes $7,000 every year for those exact same 20 years. They finish with about $290,000. Sit with that contrast for a moment. The $100,000 you stopped touching out earned 20 straight years of fresh, disciplined saving by someone else. At some point along this road, your past self becomes a better investor than your present self could ever hope to be. That is what you are truly fighting for during the slow years. You are not merely building a balance, you are building a version of yourself that keeps working while you sleep, eat, and live the rest of your life. Let me make the cruise stage concrete, because it is hard to believe until you see it in ordinary terms. Once a balance crosses somewhere around $300,000, it is throwing off more than $20,000 a year in growth all on its own. Sit with what that means in the texture of a real life. In a single average year, untouched and unmanaged, that money quietly produces more than the price of a new car, or a full year of college tuition, or a long stretch of mortgage payments. You did not work a second job for it. You did not sell anything or time anything or outsmart anyone. Instead, you woke up, lived your year, and the account handed you that sum on the way past. A strong year in the market might do far more. By the time the balance reaches $500,000, a single ordinary year of growth can rival what a full-time job pays, and it shows up without a commute, a boss, or a single hour of your time. This is the part nobody can quite grasp from inside the danger zone, because down in that early stretch, the very same percentage produced little more than a rounding error. The math never changed. The balance standing behind it finally did. Let me bring in one more saver, Soraya, who reached the line and then watched the speed unfold with her own eyes. She kept a simple habit of writing down her balance every New Year's Day. The first decade of that little list is almost painful to read. A tiny number followed by another tiny number followed by another. Then, somewhere past the 100,000 mark, the gaps between her yearly numbers begin to explode. The first year her balance grew by more than she earned at her actual job was the year she finally understood, in her gut, what everyone had been trying to tell her all along. She did nothing differently than she had the year before. She had simply crossed the line and let the engine run on its own. Once you are past that line, here is something that should change how you think about the whole journey. The path from your first 100,000 to a full million is mostly a matter of staying out of your own way. From the crossover, contributing that same modest 7,000 a year. It takes about 26 more years to reach $1 million. Starting from zero, reaching $1 million takes around 36 years total. Notice what that means. The first 100,000, that one hardest tenth of the whole journey, eats up roughly 11 of those years. Everything after it, the remaining 900,000, pours in over the rest, faster and faster. Carried mostly by a fire you already lit. Almost all of the hard work sits at the beginning, and almost all of the reward sits at the end. So the obvious question becomes, how do you light this fire sooner? And the honest answer is the one nobody really wants to hear. Because it is not about being rich, it is about time. Time is the actual fuel here, far more than the size of any contribution. Look at three savers who each put away $7,000 a year at 7% and all stop at age 65. The one who starts at 25 ends up with about $1.4 million. The one who starts at 35 finishes with around $660,000. And the one who waits until 45 ends with roughly $290,000. Identical contributions every year for all three of them. The only difference is the moment they struck the match. Those 10-year gaps did not cost a few $1,000s here and there. The first decade alone, the one that felt most pointless to live through, was worth more than $700,000 in the final result. Which brings us to a saver named Joaquin who did not begin until he was 45. By every benchmark chart online, he is supposedly hopelessly behind. But here is what I need him, and you, to actually hear. He still ends up with nearly $300,000 he would not have had if he had kept waiting for a better time. His fire lights later and burns for fewer years, but it still lights. The lesson is not that a late start is hopeless, because it clearly is not. The lesson is that the line does not move to punish you for being late. $100,000 is roughly the crossover whether you are 25 or 50. So the single most valuable thing any of us can do is shrink the distance between today and the day we actually begin. If Joaquin had held out for the perfect moment, he would have ended with nothing at all. He started anyway, in his 40s, behind schedule. And the math still showed up and did its part for him. So if all of this lands, the practical takeaway is smaller and calmer than you might expect. You do not need a genius move. You need 3 quiet habits that protect the climb. The first is to automate the contribution so it leaves before you can spend it, because the climb is won by removing willpower from the equation, not by summoning more of it. The second is to raise that contribution a little every time your income rises, since a small bump early shortens the slowest stage the most. And the third is the one almost everyone skips, and it is the difference between a fire that reaches the cruise and one that gets snuffed out halfway there. That third habit is building a base solid enough that you are never forced to sell your investments at the worst possible moment. So before you walk away believing the whole strategy is simply contribute and wait, I need you to understand the risk that quietly ends most success stories before they ever get going. The fire only changes your life if it never gets interrupted. That entire acceleration we just walked through depends on one fragile condition: that you stay invested through every kind of market, including the genuinely frightening ones. Here is the trap waiting for you. Markets fall. They always have, and they always will. Somewhere inside your 11-year climb toward that first 100,000, you will live through a period where your balance drops by a third while the headlines scream that this time is truly different and it is all over. If you are forced to sell during one of those drops because you have no cash set aside and no cushion, and an emergency hits at exactly the wrong time, you do not simply take a temporary loss. You knock the boulder all the way back to the bottom of the hill and begin the slow climb again from the start. The people who fail at this rarely fail because they chose the wrong fund. They fail because real life forced them to sell at the exact wrong moment. So the true foundation of everything we have talked about is not the exciting part. The foundation is the boring, unglamorous base underneath it all that lets you never have to interrupt the climb. It means having enough stability in your financial life that a terrible year in the market becomes something you can calmly watch on a screen rather than something that wipes you out and forces your hand. A real plan gets built from the ground up, and the ground floor of it is not the stock market at all. The ground floor is the steady, predictable layer that holds firm when everything above it is shaking. That steadying role is exactly what bonds are built to play, and it is why they quietly serve as the most overlooked starting point for anyone who genuinely wants to retire well. Bonds are the ballast in the hull. They are the part of your money that deliberately does not catch fire, so that the rest of it safely can. They are what let you ride straight through the crashes without selling a thing. What give you something solid to lean on while your growth engine does its slow early work, and what turn a fragile plan into one sturdy enough to actually survive long enough to reach the line. If the $100,000 crossover is the gap most people never close, then a missing foundation is the gap hiding behind that gap. The real reason so many savers get knocked out of the game before the fire ever gets its chance to light. For anyone who wants to understand where a genuinely solid retirement plan begins, the full breakdown of how bonds work and why they belong at the very base of everything is the natural next stop on this channel and the right place to start thinking about retirement early. So let me bring you all the way back to where we began. There is one exact dollar amount where your money stops crawling and starts to ignite, and now you know it lives right around $100,000. The point where a single year of growth finally matches a single year of your saving. You know the slow years are not a verdict on your character, but the price of admission. You know that the danger zone, that $40,000 to $80,000 stretch where most of the country quietly stalls and stops, is not the place to surrender, but the last hard mile before the climb finally tips in your favor. And you know that the people who reach the fire are not smarter or luckier than you are. They simply refused to stop walking in the final stretch. The line is closer than it feels from where you stand. It sits in nearly the same place for almost everyone, and the only real question left is how soon you decide to start closing the distance.